This is part 4 of King George, What Was His Problem? The Whole Hilarious Story of the American Revolution by Steve Shankin. Part 4 is George Washington, Meet Your Army. King George was hoping to smack the rebels with a smart blow, but he was about to be disappointed. Before sunrise on the morning of May 10th, 1775, a Vermont patriot named Ethan Allen stepped into a boat on Lake Champlain. Allen and his men pushed out into the cold, choppy water and began silently rowing across the lake. The second blow of the American Revolution was about to be delivered, and not by the British. Here comes Ethan Allen. This story begins in early May 1775, when a Connecticut lawyer named Noah Phelps stopped shaving. Once he had a nice little beard going, he disguised himself as a poor peddler, a guy who sells pots and tools door to door. Then he walked right up to the gates of Fort Ticonderoga, a British fort in northern New York. British soldiers asked the sloppy-looking peddler what he wanted. Phelps said he needed a shave. Could the fort's barber help him out? The soldiers let Phelps into the fort. While Phelps sat still in the barber's chair, his eyes spied the condition of the fort. Crumbling walls, board soldiers. It was just as he had hoped. Fort Ty, as the locals called it, was not prepared for an attack. Noah Phelps passed the information on to the Green Mountain Boys, a group of patriot farmers from the Green Mountains of Vermont. The boys were led by Ethan Allen, standing 6'6" with a furious temper. Allen was not the kind of guy you would want to have as an enemy. He was known to beat up two men at once by lifting them off the ground and banging them together. But on the morning of May 10th, Ethan Allen was perfectly calm. He had 80 of the boys row across Lake Champlain, reaching the New York side of the lake just before sunrise. There in front of them was their target, Fort Ticonderoga. One British soldier sat guarding the fort's gates. Or he was supposed to be guarding the gates. Technically, he was asleep. Party at Fort Ty. What woke the guard that morning? Probably it was the sound of 83 large Americans charging toward him, whooping and screaming like wild animals. The sleepy soldier stood up, lifted his gun, fired once, threw the gun on the ground, and ran into the fort, leaving the gates open behind him. Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys were right on his heels. Inside the fort, a British officer named Jocelyn Feltham sat up suddenly in bed. I was awakened by a number of shrieks, he explained. I jumped up. I ran undressed to knock on Captain de la Place's door. Captain de la Place was the commander of the fort, but he was still asleep. So Lieutenant Feltham went back to his room, grabbed some clothes, and stepped out into the hall. The next thing he knew, he was standing face to face with a very excited giant named Ethan Allen. Allen was knocking on de Place's door and shouting things like, "Come out of there, you old rat!" Lieutenant Feltham tried to appear calm and in control, which is hard to do when you have your pants in your hands. He demanded to know by what authority Ethan Allen was attacking this British fort. Allen roared back, "In the name of the great Jehovah and the Continental Congress." This was a cool-sounding answer, and it later became famous. But at the time, Lieutenant Feltham just seemed confused. He began to speak again. Allen later wrote, but I interrupted him and, with my drawn sword over his head, again demanded an immediate surrender. The sword over the head did the trick. Feltham surrendered Fort Ticonderoga to the Americans. Within minutes, the Green Mountain Boys found 90 gallons of rum in the fort cellar. The party lasted 3 days. More important, Ethan Allen and the boys had captured more than 100 British cannons. If the Americans were really going to fight a war with Britain, they would need those big guns. Walk with me, Sam. But were the Americans going to fight a war with Britain? That question was still being debated down in Philadelphia. One early morning in June, John and Samuel Adams met to talk over current events. I walked with Mr. Samuels in the State House yard, remembered John, for a little exercise and fresh air, before the hour of Congress. The Adams cousins knew that many members of the Continental Congress were not too thrilled about Ethan Allen's Fort Ty attack. These members were still hoping to find a peaceful solution to their conflict with the British government. In fact, Congress actually ordered Allen to make a careful list of all the items found at Fort Ticonderoga. That way they could give everything back to the British if war was avoided. John and Samuel thought this was ridiculous. Wasn't it obvious by now that King George was never going to compromise? It was time for the 13 colonies to join together, form one big army, and fight for independence. In fact, John had decided that this was the day that he would try to convince Congress to pick a leader for the new American army. But who should that leader be? He wanted Samuel's advice. The cousins knew their friend John Hancock expected to be offered the job, and Hancock was definitely one of the most famous and popular Patriot leaders. The thing is, Hancock didn't know anything about leading an army. That could be a problem. Besides, the cousins agreed the American army should represent all regions of the colonies. The perfect thing would be to pick a leader from Virginia, the biggest of the southern colonies, that would help unite Americas in the long fight ahead. If only there was someone from Virginia, someone known and respected by everyone, someone with army experience, someone smart, tough, committed to the cause. John Adams loses a friend. When Congress assembled, I rose in my place, said John Adams. It was time, Adams told Congress, to create a continental army, with soldiers from all 13 colonies, and it was time to elect a leader of the army. Members leaned forward in their seats. Who was Adams about to name? John Hancock listened with a proud grin on his face. He really thought he was about to hear his name. And John Adams enjoyed toying with Hancock a little bit. He made sure to keep an eye on Hancock's face as he named the man he believed should command the Continental Army. George Washington. Hancock's smile collapsed in an instant. I never remarked a more sudden and striking change of countenance, facial expression, Adams said. Then Samuel Adams announced that he too supported Washington, which upset Hancock even more. Mr. Hancock even loved me so well after this event as he had done before, John Adams remembered. Meanwhile, George Washington jumped up and ran out of the room. He wanted to give everyone a chance to talk about him without worrying they might hurt his feelings. So Washington waited outside while the other members of Congress decided whether or not he should lead the American Revolution. George Washington, love poet. Was George Washington, age 43, about to be offered the opportunity of a lifetime, or was he about to be handed an impossible job? Possibly both. He must have wondered about this as he waited in the library. As a boy in Virginia, George had dreamed of becoming a military hero. He even tried to run away from home and join the British Navy when he was 14, but his mother discovered the plan and refused to let him go. She was a very protective mom, and a bit stingy too. Young George once asked her for money so he could take music lessons. She offered to lend him the cash, so George never learned to play the violin. But he did spend some time working on his love poetry. Here's part of a letter he sent to Frances Alexander, a young woman he admired. Notice the first letters of each line spell out her name. From your bright sparkling eyes I was undone. Rays you have more transparent than the sun. Amidst its glory in the rising day, none can you equal in your bright array. On June 16, 1775, George Washington sat down to write a very different letter. This time he was writing to his wife, Martha, or as he called her in his letters, my dear Patsy. Congress had just made it official. George Washington was the commander of the new Continental Army. I am now set down to write to you on a subject which fills me with inexpressible concern, wrote George to Martha. It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care. Why was Washington filled with concern? How would you feel if the future of an entire country was placed in your hands? Washington told Congress, I this day declare with utmost sincerity I do not think myself equal to the command. But there was no time for doubts or worries. Washington packed up his things and headed north to join the army, which was camped outside of Boston. While he was on his way, a messenger brought Washington some urgent news. A major battle had just been fought in Boston. When he heard the report, Washington said, "Wait a second. Let's check on the battle first, then we'll hear what Washington said about." A little elbow room. The last time we were in Boston was 2 months ago, just after the battles of Lexington and Concord. The British soldiers were trapped in town, surrendered by thousands of American militiamen. This was still the situation in June 1775, when a new team of British generals arrived from London. One of the generals, John Burgoyne, was shocked to see a bunch of angry farmers holding the mighty British army in a trap. "What? 10,000 King's troops shut up? Well, let us get in, and we'll soon find elbow room." So the British decided to get themselves a little elbow room. The first step was to seize control of Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill, 2 hills above Boston. From this high ground, they could start blasting away at the American camp. But remember all those Patriot spies in and around Boston? They learned the British plans and got the news to the American soldiers, and the Americans beat the British to the hills. Get ready for a long day. Peter Brown was one of the about 1,200 Americans who spent the night of June 16th on Breed's Hill, building a fort of earth and logs. He worked there undiscovered till about 5 in the morning. Brown later told his mother, "After a tense and tiring night of work, the men were ready for bed. Fatigued by our labor," he explained, having no sleep the night before, very little to eat, no drink but rum, we grew faint, thirsty, hungry, and weary. But there was no rest in sight. When the sun rose, the British looked up at Breed's Hill. They were used to seeing cows and sheep grazing up there. Now, all of a sudden, there was a fort. They quickly began blasting cannons up at Breed's Hill. The enemy fired very warm from Boston and from on board their ships, Peter Brown reported. Colonel William Prescott, the American commander on the hill, saw the rising fear in his men's eyes. Most of these guys had never been in a battle before. Prescott tried to keep them calm by walking up and down on the top of the fort's walls. He wanted to show them it was safe. It wasn't safe. A cannonball came bouncing into the fort and took off a man's head. He was so near me, Prescott remembered, that my clothes were besmithered with his blood and brains, which I wiped off in some degree with a handful of fresh earth. Ooh. None of the men had ever seen anything this awful before. It was about to get worse. The men looked down and saw more than 2,000 British soldiers gathering below Breed's Hill, the Battle of Bunker Hill. The British started marching up the hill. Colonel Prescott knew his men had only about 15 rounds of ammunition each. Knowing they would have to make each shot count, Prescott gave the guys some famous last-second advice. "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." If you think the Americans had it bad, though, look at it from the British point of view. The British soldiers were now hiking uphill through thick grass, carrying 125 pounds of equipment under a blazing sun. They were marching in nice, neat rows, making themselves easy targets, because the generals considered that the most honorable way to fight. And they were marching right up to the front of the American fort. All over Boston, thousands of people stood watching from church steeples and the roofs of houses. The British soldiers marched to within about 100 feet of the fort, and they kept coming. 90 feet, 80 feet, 70. Then the American guns exploded. The British were blown backward. A British officer named Francis Rawdon said, "They rose up and poured in so heavy a fire upon us that the oldest officers say they never saw a sharper action." The Americans cheered and waved their hats as the surviving British soldiers tripped down the hill. The British officers told their men to turn around and attack again. They were driven back down the hill a second time. So the British charged up the hill a third time, and they finally captured the fort, though at an awful cost. 1,000 British soldiers were shot that day. Even though most of the fighting took place on Breed's Hill, this battle became known as the Battle of Bunker Hill. No one seems to know why. The important thing is that the Americans were proud of the Battle of Bunker Hill, though when you get driven out of your fort, that counts as a loss. Facing those brutal British charges gave the Americans badly needed confidence. They really could stand toe-to-toe with the British. Washington takes command. The liberties of the country are safe. That's what George Washington said when he heard the news from Bunker Hill. Like everyone else, he had been worried that untrained American volunteers would not stand their ground in the face of a fierce British attack. Now he knew better. When Washington got a look at his new Continental Army and he started worrying again, Washington found about 20,000 men crowded into a stinky, dirty camp of tents and shacks. These guys were not used to doing laundry. They considered it women's work. So they just walked about in filthy, rotting clothes. There were serious shortages of guns, ammunition, and fresh food, and soldiers from different colonies were too busy fighting each other to think about attacking the British. That winter, one snowball fight between soldiers from Massachusetts and Virginia exploded into a 1,000-man fistfight. Washington personally plunged into the mess and started yanking people apart. As he tried to discipline his army, Washington found himself giving some strange orders. The general does not mean to discourage the practice of bathing while the weather is warm enough to continue it, Washington told his soldiers, but he expressly forbids it at or near the bridge in Cambridge. Why is that, General? It has been observed and complained of that many men, lost to all sense of decency and common modesty, are running about naked upon the bridge while its passengers, even ladies of the first fashion in the neighborhood, are passing over it. Yes, getting these guys to behave was going to be a real challenge. Board in Boston. Meanwhile, the British Army was still bottled up in Boston. There was very little to eat that winter and nothing to do. Lieutenant Martin Hunter remembered one way the men tried to fight the boredom. Plays were acted twice every week by the officers and some of the Boston ladies, he said. One night, the British actors were about to put on a new farce or comedy. It was a play that made fun of Americans as clowns and cowards. British soldiers dressed up as Americans and got ready to take the stage. The Americans knew about the play, thanks to those spies again. They decided to have some fun. Just as the show was about to start, American soldiers started firing at a British fort in town. Inside the playhouse, one of the British actors, dressed as an American, ran on stage and shouted for silence. He announced that the rebels were attacking, but the audience started laughing. They thought this was part of the show. The whole audience thought the sergeant was acting a part in the farce, Martin Hunter reported, and that he did it so well there was a general clap and such a noise that he could not be heard again for a considerable time. The soldier kept shouting that this was a real attack. Finally, realizing the danger, the audience members all stood up and started racing around in a panic, jumping over chairs, stepping on fiddles. The actors called out for water to wash the makeup off their faces. When they got out to the fort, they realized they had been tricked. The Americans were not really attacking Boston. And stay out. The next time it wasn't a trick. On the morning of March 3rd, 1776, British General William Howe, who had taken over command for General Gage, pulled out his telescope and looked up at some nearby hills called Dorchester Heights. He saw cannons pointing down at him. "These fellows have done more work in one night than I could make my army do in 3 months, cried Howe. Actually, it had taken more than one night to get those big guns in place. These were the cannons captured that May by Ethan Allen at Fort Ticonderoga. Washington had wanted the guns in Boston, so he sent Colonel Henry Knox to go get them. Knox was an enormous 25-year-old bookstore owner who loved to read books about cannons. In the Continental Army, he made Knox a cannon expert. They didn't have any real experts. Using sleds and teams of oxen, Knox and his men pulled the 60 cannons 300 miles from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston. Washington had them placed on Dorchester's Heights. Suddenly, General Howe decided it was time to leave town. The truth is, it's no fun living in a city with huge guns pointing down at you. The British sailed out of Boston on March 17, 1776, and they never came back. When Washington happily reported the good news to Congress, he included a special note to John Hancock, whose Boston mansion had been used by British officers. I have a particular pleasure to being able to inform you, sir, wrote Washington to Hancock, that your house received no damage worth mentioning. Your furniture is in tolerable order, and the family pictures are all left entire and untouched. The only bad news was that someone had stolen Hancock's backgammon set. Independence time? A writer named Mercy Otis Warren celebrated the liberation of Boston by writing a new play called The Blockheads. It was a comedy about the British Army in Boston, and she gave the British characters silly names like General Puff and Mr. Shallow. In the play, cowardly British officers were terrified of the Americans. Here's a sample. General Puff: you see, gentlemen, our situation. Our enemies are gaining on us hourly. One night more, perhaps, will make us their prisoners. Mr. Shallow: why will you desire us to go to battle? Are you foreseeing another Bunker Hill? Mercy Otis Warren's good friend Abigail Adams was hoping there would be more news to celebrate in 1776. She was convinced that it was time for the colonies to officially declare independence from Britain. In fact, she was wondering what her husband John and the other members of Congress were waiting for. I long to hear that you have declared an independency, wrote Abigail. John replied, as to declarations of independency, be patient. How long would Abigail have to be patient? Well, that's the next story.